what positive psychology is not. It is not the glass is half full. It is not a whole bunch of smiley faces and being happy all the time. And it's not turning lemons into lemonade. That's not it. So what is it? Well, actually, positive psychology is a powerful science. And positive psychology is actually younger than the internet. Most people date the internet back to about the mid-90s. In 1998, this fellow, Dr. Martin Seligman, who, by the way, just came out with a new book in the last month called The Hope Circuit. It's his latest. Back in 1998, Dr. Seligman was the president of the American Psychological Association, the APA. And he called on, at the annual conference, he called on psychologists to begin studying not just disease and dysfunction, which had been the history of psychology up until that point, but to study the bright side of life. He challenged psychologists to begin studying human flourishing, not just human disease and dysfunction. Now, we all know it's important to study disease and dysfunction and find cures and to help the mentally ill population. But in Seligman's mind, that wasn't enough. We also needed to study, when are things going well? What is going right? So this is one of my favorite quotes from him: working hard to manage weaknesses, while sometimes necessary, will only help us prevent failure. It will not help us reach excellence. So this new science of positive psychology is about human flourishing. And it's evidence-based, meaning positive psychologists, they actually study what we call the study of what's right, both in terms of positive institutions, positive organizations, positive traits. So here's a way to think about it. Positive psychologists, they study relationships. So they'll study healthy marriages, what makes for a healthy team, as an example. They also study what's called personal fulfillment, which the coaches on this webinar know is often a key piece of coaching. So what brings people joy? What brings people meaning and purpose? Positive psychologists study those things. They also study topics such as resilience, hope. My favorite, and what I studied when I was at the University of Pennsylvania, was optimism. So yes, we study those things, but it's from a research basis. And then, of course, applied positive psychology is taking what we know from models and theories and then applying them into the real world. And when it comes to business, an area that positive psychologists often study is productivity. What makes teams more collaborative? What makes employees more engaged? How can we produce better results and be more successful? So those are the things that positive psychologists study. Now, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're no longer in your current role, whatever that might be. You're no longer employed at that company, or you're no longer running your own practice. And I want you to take off that hat. And instead, I want you to put on an architect's hat. You are now all architects. So I would ask you, would you study all of the bridges that have collapsed? Or would you study all of the bridges that have withstood the test of time? If you were a bridge architect, what would you study to become really, really competent at your job? So again, I'm going to step out of the training for a moment. And this is where I'd ask the audience, how many people would study all of the bridges that have collapsed? How many people would study all of the bridges that have withstood the test of time? Right? Okay. Now, I'm going to step back into the training, okay, back in, and I would say, okay, chances are you would study both, correct? You would want to know, okay, why do bridges collapse? What went wrong? And you would also want to study the bridges that have withstood the test of time. And yet, in business, we're really good at studying the bridges that have collapsed, but we're not so good at studying when things are going well and what can we learn from that. So I'm going to draw your attention. There's actually, this is on page 66 in the book. There are different ways to boost performance. One way that traditional leaders use is they look for what's wrong and fix it, and they seek gaps and they want to close them. Whereas a strength-based leader, they're looking for finding out what's right and trying to replicate it, and they seek strengths and try to leverage them. So I wouldn't want anyone to walk out of here today thinking that positive psychology is just about, happy faces and smiley faces. No, it's the science, it's the research. And I wouldn't want anybody to think that focusing in on what's right means that you ignore what's wrong. No, that's a very important, valuable skill to have. We're just saying you're missing out on a big part of the results equation if all you ever do is focus in on that traditional leader, focusing on what's wrong and seeking gaps. You're missing out on a big piece of how we boost productivity if that's all you do. So I'm going to step out of the training for a moment and take questions. Yeah, go ahead, Fatih.
For example, when you study entrepreneurs, actually, they tend to focus on what's not going well first, and then they replace it with what's right. So this doesn't really mean that, if you're seeing what's wrong, it's bad. It's just how you approach it, I guess.
Right. Right. And so spotting things that are wrong or spotting gaps, services that aren't being delivered right now, that's a valuable skill to have.
Yeah.
But if that's all you do, you're missing out on a big part of how do we boost performance. Any other comments or questions?
I have one comment, but that's very personal.
No, go ahead.
Two things. I couldn't catch the entire thing. You said leaders have 4 mindsets: productive, resilient, and you said 2 more. I couldn't catch them.
Yep.
And then you label traditional leader and strength-based leader.
Mm-hmm.
I usually tend to have an issue with these types of things.
Okay.
Humans, I think we are both good and bad. We're both traditional and strength-based, and so when we introduce information to an organization like this, you're a leader, you're a manager. I think it divides the organizations.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's my personal, observation. And so I try to refrain from these things. I mean, I've been studying positive psychology for a long time, and this is what it teaches us. But I think personally, I still prefer not to put it that way. At least for some organizations, it doesn't work, but for some others, it may work well. But usually my experience is that, when we start labeling like you're traditional, you're strength-based, or you're a manager, you're a leader, I mean, it just messes up the psyche of the organization.
it can be divisive, right? Or people think it's either or.
Exactly. I
right?
mean, the information is right for people who understands how to use it. But when you offer it to an organization that's not really willing to, put together the systems well or understand, what you're saying, then they just mess the entire organization. Then you have a bigger problem to solve. Mm-hmm. So, for this group, I understand what this means exactly. But, for at least many organizations in Turkey, it drives me crazy.
And I think you bring up a really good point, Fatih, in that you need to adapt and tailor this to fit your audience. Well, one of the cohorts, we had someone from China, and some of the things, didn't translate in how he would position it for a Chinese audience. So there are things that you're going to need to do to be able to adapt some of this content. But that's why it's so important when I said earlier, it's not either or. When it comes to this, that's still important. But if that's all we do, we miss out.
Don't take me wrong. I'm not saying this is wrong. I just want to share my experience, because sometimes in organizations, it's it's not understood so well what you mean by this. So sometimes you may want to refrain from saying traditional or strength-based, and sometimes you may want to say so.
Yeah, that's a great point. So tailoring it to your audience.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to step back into the training. So there's a couple more slides for the training. So then I go into, so that sounds pretty easy, right? Focusing on what's right, seek strengths. That sounds pretty easy, but it's actually quite hard. And why? Why is this so hard? And I'm trying to remember who mentioned it earlier in our group, but the notion of negativity bias. It's what psychologists call negativity bias. We are hardwired to look for what's wrong. I think it was Aida mentioned that. So for early humans to survive, we had to be on that lookout, right? For the saber-toothed tiger, for danger. And so our brains are wired that way to look for what's wrong. Now I'm going to step out of the training for a moment, and I would ask the group a couple of real basic application questions, such as, how many of you have school-age children? Raise your hand. What do you focus in on when they come home with their report card? The 4 A's or the 1 C? And that generally gets a chuckle out of a group. If it's a group of leaders, I might say, raise your hand. How many people have ever participated in a 360 feedback assessment? Raise your hand. People raise their hands. And then I would ask, so what do you do when you get your 360 results? Do you go through all your strengths, or do you flip through the report and get to the development areas? Right? We tend to skip right over our strengths and go right to our development areas. And then a couple other, I'm going to step back in, so I'll ask a few questions. And I'll say negativity bias shows up in all kinds of places. You've heard the customer service statistics that say when we have poor service, we tell 13 people. When we have really stellar service, we only tell 5. We tend to ruminate over a negative comment from a friend and skip right over a compliment. We oftentimes don't even acknowledge the compliment. Oh, that's a beautiful dress you're wearing. Oh, this whole thing, right? We skip right over it. And yet we'll ruminate over a negative comment from a friend or colleague. In Profit from the Positive, we reference a very famous article by Roy Baumeister called Bad is Stronger Than Good. And that's in the reference section. So we have this built-in negativity bias. So I'm going to step out of the training for a moment and say, this is where I would do a group exercise. If it was live in a very large group, I would have people do this as a table group exercise. If it was virtual, I would have people type in their comments. So the questions are these: what are you already doing right? And look at it from those 3 levels that Fatih and I talked about earlier: your organization, your department, and you personally. What are you already doing right? And I would give people an opportunity to answer that first in their table groups, if it was a really large group. And then I would go into a debrief. And again, depending on the size of the group, how long that would go on for, it depends. So that is the first piece of content. That's simply translating what is positive psychology and what is profit from the positive. So I want to open it up now, and we've got just a couple other follow-up slides. I'll leave a minute at the end to do. So any other questions around that piece of content? Today's the smallest piece of content. The rest of the weeks, you'll get much more content. But anything else that you had questions about? Okay, well then I am going to wrap this up. We do a debrief in homework for next week. We always start the next week with reviewing the homework, answering questions that people might have after today. So we always do that. So here's the homework. We call it Making It Stick. So explain, teach, or coach at least one person, and that person can be a colleague, a client, a friend, a family member, whomever, a piece of today's content. Now, the content was simply what is profit from the positive and what is positive psychology. So explain, teach, or coach at least one person. Do we have any coaches on the line that ever use the 10 people approach in your coaching? You ever use that, anybody? Oftentimes I'll work with clients and I'll say, go out and tell 10 people that this is what you want to do. So we're only asking you to do one, but of course you can do more than one. This came out of our very first cohort where, again, we were experimenting with the program, and one of the participants was the head of HR at a company out in California, and her president of her company was happy to send her to this program, but he expected her to meet with him each week and share what she was learning. And we thought, wow, that's a great way to make it stick. So subsequent cohorts, that's the homework for next week, is to just explain or coach or teach one person that content. And the reading is to read the introduction in chapter 1 of the Productive Leader. And there's a couple other recommended readings on the recommended reading list that I'll mention in our follow-up email that I'll send you after today. So next week, quick preview is the Productive Leader. We're going to be focusing in on a lot of content. There's 4 tools in that chapter. So I'll be focusing on the Productive Leader. After today, you're also going to receive what I call the workshop version of these slides, meaning this is a certificate program. So you see that, we have stretch breaks, we have overview, we have all kinds of other things that we do. We take all those slides out and give you what we call the workshop slides that you could insert your logo. It gets rid of all the certificate program stuff, and it's for you to use. So you'll get that, as well as the recording and a few other things in today's email. So be sure to connect with each other on LinkedIn or Facebook. Join our Facebook page by the same name, Profit from the Positive. You can follow us on Twitter at ProfitBook. You're a community now. You can connect with each other and really help each other in your practices. So with that, thank you, Positive Deviants. Just the fact that you showed up here today tells me you're a positive deviant. And I will see you next week, same time, same place. So
thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Margaret. Have a great day.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And we'll see
Thanks,
friends
Phil.
from Finland next week. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.